Zachipedia, and today, let's discuss Cinco de Mayo. Now, before we begin, I have a few misconceptions about this holiday that I need to clarify. One, Cinco de Mayo is not Mexican Independence Day. Mexican Independence Day is on September the 16th, and some Mexicans claim that it took place with the assistance of Bolivar in 1810, while on the contrary, some Spaniards claim that it didn't occur until later in 1825. Now, neither of these are Cinco de Mayo, and that's a whole nother story. Let's get back, because Cinco de Mayo means 5th of May, not 16th of September. Now, another misconception is that the Mexican-American War was a tip-off to Cinco de Mayo. That's also inaccurate because the Mexican-American War did cause a temporary economic fall down after it occurred because they took a quarter of Mexican land, the Americans. So therefore that did contribute for a while. But Cinco de Mayo occurred about 12 years after the end of the Mexican-American War. So that didn't really have a huge impact by then. Lastly, one thing that's very, very unclear about Cinco de Mayo is that the Americans did not help the Mexicans. The Americans did offer to help, but the persistent Mexicans denounced it because they were still feuding and angry about, of course, the Mexican-American War. There's actually a painting in the Louvre that depicts American soldiers fighting alongside the Mexicans, which is inaccurate. Actually, those soldiers are French soldiers fighting against the Mexicans. By now, you're probably really getting curious about the brief history of Cinco de Mayo. Well, let's get into it. The background of Cinco de Mayo began all the way in 1861. During this time, Mexico was in the middle of a civil war between the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party, two, of course, Mexican political parties. Now, unlike American politics, both parties were feuding about which side Congress would take. But instead of having political arguments and blaming other politicians on scandals, they decided to fight each other in a long 2-decade civil war. Now, around the time, the Conservatives were winning against the Liberals, and the Liberals needed all the money they can get. Now, around 1861, the French came and discovered that, mostly abundant on the Liberal land claim, there was an immense amount of corn. Now, the French wanted to make profit and have the corn, so what they did is they started a contract with the Liberal president of Mexico, Benito Juarez, and decided that the Mexicans every month would give them a quantity of their corn, and in return the Mexicans would pay them a humongous amount of money, which would be very valuable to the Mexicans' war effort against the Conservatives. Now, this went on, you could say, harmoniously for another year or so, until in 1862, two things happened. One, the Conservatives managed to push back Liberal forces and began occupying a lot more of the cornfields. And two, a drought occurred under the, of course, unlucky Liberal side, and they lost the remaining cornfields that they still had. This meant that when the Mexicans deposited their money into the Mexican government, or the Liberal government, the Mexicans had nothing to give in return to the French. However, the understanding French said, okay, that's fine, but you need to pay us our money back. Now, the Mexicans were receiving about $30 million a month from the French for their corn, which in today's value is over $300 million. In the war effort, and with the drought and all the poverty, the Mexican government couldn't afford to pay back the French. So now the French were getting kind of irritated and said, well, who has the corn? Juarez had no choice but to tell them that the Conservatives had the remaining live cornfields. So the French asked the Conservatives, hey, can we have some of your corn and we'll pay you some of this? However, the conservatives were not as negotiable, and they refused, according to their political beliefs, to export any of their grain to the French for no matter how much money. The French, though, still wanted their money and their crop. So you know what they said? They said, all right, let's just invade the good old land of Mexico. So the French set up a humongous warship and fleet of about 2,000 men. And they had heavy artillery, including muskets, bayonets, iron ore pistols, all the 9 yards, everything they needed to defeat the Mexicans. The Mexicans, on the contrary, had advanced weaponry, but they didn't have advanced minerals to make it. Therefore, most of their weapons were made out of not as advanced iron ore, or even in some cases, wood. Therefore, when the French landed in Puebla in 1862, on May 1st, the Mexicans didn't believe they were going to win. As a matter of fact, on May 4th, President Juarez made a speech to his people called "The Day the Sun Sets." Finally, that's actually the name, where he tells the people this will most likely be their last day as independent Mexican citizens. On May 5th, 1862, the French finally began trying to invade the Mexicans from Puebla. However, the Mexicans, who still wanted to put up a fight, despite the thought that they were going to lose, sent their soldiers to meet the French at Puebla. Now, even when they sent their soldiers, despite the disadvantage in weaponry and advanced training, the Mexicans didn't have that well of soldiers. For since most of their heavily trained soldiers were fighting in the Civil War, most of the volunteers for the war were as young as 14 years old. Therefore, the French, who were highly experienced and one of the best armies in the world, probably underestimated the Mexicans and believed they were going to win. Now, despite the fact that the Mexicans had heavier numbers, as I said before, there were a lot of things that went in favor of the French. And at the beginning of the battle, it seemed as if the French were going to win. Within just 2 hours, the French had slayed nearly 3,000 Mexican troops. However, something happened in the middle of the battle, which caused the French to lose their ground. All of a sudden, the Mexicans began winning and began pushing the Mexicans further back off their city. By dawn, the French were already on their ship, lost over 1,000 men, and were forced to retreat back to Paris. It was Mexican victory. This was greatly unexpected and extremely beneficial to the liberals of Mexico. And Juarez decided to make a national holiday on the day of the battle, May 5th, which he called Cinco de Mayo, in which in Puebla they still have today reenactments of the Mexican-French battles and have festivities, and is now celebrated all over the world, even in France. Now, the French in about 1863 did come back and invade the Yucatan, but now the conservatives won the Civil War and took over the liberal land, and by 1867 managed to ward the French out again. Well, I hope this video taught you a little bit about Cinco de Mayo. By the way, today's Latin quote is "Historia est magistra vitae," which means in Latin, history is the teacher of life. Once you understand that quote, you'll go very far in life.